So today I'm going to be recapping my July movies. I watched 13 movies this month. Not all winners, but I did watch them all, and I do have opinions on all of them. So let's get into it. Alrighty, so starting off strong with the movie I really expected to enjoy. I thought this would be like a new comfort movie. It's set in a very lush Italian countryside in the summer, very vibey, great cinematography, and I hated this. This is one of my least favorite movies I've ever seen. The premise is basically that a teenage girl goes to stay with some distant relatives for the summer and hopes to reconnect with a lost young love. And it is so predatory. The main character is played by Liv Tyler, who I think was like 19 or 20 when they made this movie. She films nude scenes, which I don't love. Basically, Liv Tyler is preyed upon by every man she encounters in this movie, even men who are like 3 times her age. It's just creepy. It's inappropriate and uncomfortable to watch. I know that this director is considered one of the greats, and I think sometimes male directors who are considered great, when they make really predatory films, are treated as being like subversive or avant-garde or like pushing the envelope. Like, this is like art house cinema, but I think it's just kind of criminal and bad. The movie itself is boring. It's not a super compelling story to begin with, especially not when these old ass dusty men are just grabbing at Liv Tyler the entire time. Some of the scenes escalate to violence, and it is all treated by the film as like part of romance and sexuality and passion, and this idea that like when you're really exploring yourself and really coming to terms with your sensuality in the summer in Italy, like anything kind of goes, and I don't agree with that. So Letterboxd review for this was, "This film needs Jesus." This was an unholy film that I watched, and I would not recommend. This movie did not commit any crimes, unless you consider the crime of being very boring. The plot is a standard one. Basically, an up-and-coming theater girl gets her big break and becomes really famous and popular, and then has to contend with the fact that everyone from her old life doesn't get her anymore, and decide for herself if she wants to be a sellout, basically, and pursue money and fame over hanging out with her guy pals, I guess. I didn't love Rita Hayworth in this. She's not really one of my favorite old Hollywood stars. She was pretty stiff and just like lacking in charisma. Gene Kelly does do a duet with himself in this that is definitely worth watching just for that dance alone. It's very cool and creative and experimental, as Gene Kelly liked to be, but otherwise the music felt really flat. I have a hard time with musicals if I'm not into the music. Kind of a crazy take, but I am currently reading a book called All About Thelma and Eve, about female sidekick characters and the space that they hold in this era of film for unconventional women. They got to be funny and eccentric and subversive and kind of play against norms. And one of the main focuses of that book is Eve Arden, who was in this film. I do think the way that Eve Arden in this movie holds a very dominant, authoritative position and clearly is somebody of power and is just kind of masculine coded is very interesting, and the contrast between that and Rita Hayworth, in the way that Rita Hayworth is supposed to be this beautiful, elegant, but also like relatable every girl next door, is interesting. So there are interesting themes that you can parse out from this, but overall as a film I was just kind of bored.
Seems that it's a kind of jig named for someone about so big. He rambles around the town, preamble.
So I saw this at the theater as a double feature with CoverGirl, a back-to-back Rita Hayworth experience for a non-Rita Hayworth fan was a little bit interesting. This one was definitely my favorite of the two. It was my first time seeing Fred Astaire on the big screen, which was very cool and very striking just how weird he looks. He's just a funny looking man, and I find it so interesting that he built such a career off of being like an iconically charismatic, like classy gentleman when he looks like he should be named like Pee-wee. No shade. There's some better music in this. There's a song, An Old Fashioned Girl. I love the Ella Fitzgerald cover of that, so I really enjoyed that. This was just a little bit more like atmospheric. It was a little bit more interesting. I thought Rita Hayworth's character was a little bit more interesting. It's a very contrived screwball comedy plot of like mistaken identity, basically. But I thought that Rita Hayworth's character was just a little bit more different than what you usually see in this era of cinema. She's just very like self-assured and kind of has the upper hand the whole time, and which is typical of female characters in that screwball comedy. I feel like Rita Hayworth gets treated more of like the bombshell type, but she had a very like assertive, dominant, kind of like Rosalind Russell energy in this. This is one of many Sofia Coppola movies that I've seen. It wasn't my favorite. I was expecting to like it a little bit more than I did. Obviously, a big thing about Sofia Coppola's films is the way that she pays attention to aspects of womanhood and femininity. I hesitate to say that she captures like girlhood just because her movies are exclusively about white people. I don't think that there's any kind of universal experience being represented. This movie is set during the Civil War and exclusively is about white people. And there is one casual like throwaway mention about enslavement early on in the film that kind of read to me like, I don't want to get into that, so I'm just going to stop you right there. That was kind of the way that read to me. I do love the way that Sofia Coppola uses place in her movies. Her movies are very clearly set in a time period. I wouldn't necessarily say they're like crazy historically accurate, but they're very in tune with the like aesthetics and I think the way that we imagine places, even if they're not what they actually looked like. Her movies work best when she makes that the audience aware of that and kind of like subverts that. In this, it felt more just like everyone's gonna repost this on Tumblr. I do love aesthetics. So I did like the costuming. I thought the house was very cool. I think when Sofia Coppola is at her best, the way that she kind of romanticizes a certain aspect of femininity is subversive and kind of calls attention to the fact that there is little attention for it and like little appreciation for it, but also if you don't do it, then you are not a high value female. I don't think she did it best in this movie, but it is present and it is interesting, and I would say it's worth watching. I did find it very stressful. I know it's not really true horror, and if you are a fan of that, you probably think this is like the lightest, easiest watch ever, but I did find it very distressing, and it is a bit gory.
They arrive promptly at 9, because if they're not on time, they know they'll get the sack. But before they begin the daily grind, the boss takes his cup black.
I loved this movie. I was a little bit nervous I wouldn't, but I really ended up liking it. I really liked Jane Fonda in this. Dolly Parton obviously was amazing. I'm not a Dolly Parton fan, only because I'm just so unfamiliar with her work, but it has been on my to-do list to become a Dolly Parton stan, and after seeing this, I'm well on my way. She just has that star quality. Like, even if you didn't know who she was when you were watching this movie, you would think like that is the biggest star in the world. Like, there's just something so charismatic and compelling and endearing about her. You just can't take your eyes off her. I've also, because I'm not a Dolly Parton stan, I've never seen her younger than like 75, so I just was having a whole moment of like, wow, this is who Dolly Parton is. But I thought this movie made really interesting choices, and was much more political than I expected. It was much more a critique of capitalism, and I was expecting it to be kind of like a pseudo-feminist, like girl boss movie, and it really wasn't. It was very subversive and unexpected. Something I really appreciated was that the male boss, who is this really sleazy, gross misogynist, is depicted as such without being exceptionally vile or disgusting. I expected him to have to be so horrible for the reaction that the female characters had, but he wasn't. Not to say that he wasn't horrible, but it was just much more like casual misogyny than I expected. And I thought it was really cool that they had the women respond to him so extremely without having to like prove that they needed to. Their frustration and their pain was like just enough on its own. Also, something I thought was really interesting was that he was totally enabled by the system, but he himself had like no actual power, and the women constantly like physically overtake him. It's a really interesting contrast to the Beguiled, where the second the man gets angry, he has total control and total power, even though there's like 7 girls and 1 guy, and there's no, and also, spoiler, he loses his leg, and there's no point in time in the film where they're like, maybe we could just own him. And I thought that was really interesting in contrast to 9 to 5, where it didn't have this attitude that men are like inherently capable of things that women aren't and take advantage of that. It was just like, we've designed a society in which this kind of behavior thrives. I find that more of an interesting perspective. I saw this in the theater with the director, which was really cool. I was not expecting to like it very much because I am a Madonna hater. Again, no shade. She's just not for me. I don't like her music. Sorry. But I actually really like this. And like Dolly Parton in 9 to 5, she had such an obvious star quality. Like, it is undeniable. You totally understand why she was the coolest girl in the world. She is the coolest girl in this movie. But I just really like this overall. It was really funny. I did see it in the theater, so that makes it like a little bit more elevated when you have a whole audience that's laughing, and it was clearly like devout fans of this movie. But it was funny and wacky and unconventional and just exactly the type of tone that I like in movies. That is just a little bit like eccentric and unexpected and just off the rails enough that it's totally absurd, but just grounded enough that you also kind of can see yourself in all of it. Also, Aidan Quinn is so hot in this. Just absolutely delicious. It was one of the most like exciting male performances I've ever seen. Like, I was into it.
We're on an island together for 7 years?
Yes, Your Honor.
Not alone.
Yes.
Is that in the brief?
No, Your Honor, no.
Oh, that should be in the brief. That's the most interesting part of the case.
In the same vein, I felt similarly about this movie. It's definitely just much more absurd, but it's so silly. It's so fun. I love Cary Grant and Irene Dunne together. They just play off each other so well. Irene Dunne is so funny, timelessly funny. Like, there are SNL skits from last week that you're like, that's not so funny anymore. And Irene Dunne was giving these performances almost 100 years ago, and it all still lands. She has a few like physical comedy moments in this that are like absolutely genius. I'm still thinking about them. They're so funny. Screwball comedies are one of my favorite genres, so I'm surprised I hadn't seen this before. They're just so different and weird and funny and queer. I would definitely recommend this and exploring the whole genre if you haven't. I've said this before, but I just love the way that they play with gender and the way that both parties are being absolutely ridiculous, and the comedy comes from the two of them butting heads in a very like equal way. There's a femininity to Cary Grant's performance and a masculinity to Irene Dunne's performance that I think just doesn't get done in the same way anymore. This has been on my watch list for a long time, so I was really kind of amped about it, and I felt a little bit let down. It's super slow. Obviously, that is part of the point of the movie. It is not supposed to be like a super fast pace, but I did find it dragged a little bit. As somebody who goes on a lot of house tours and architectural tours, I appreciated that aspect of this movie, and I relate to Haley Lou Richardson in that I also would want an older man to just follow me around and think all my opinions were really interesting. That is definitely a dream of mine, but it just felt a little bit half-baked to me, and I did find their dynamic a little bit weird. Casey is like a recent high school graduate, and this man is a full-grown adult, and there were vibes, and I don't really know what this was about in the end. Their vibe wasn't super weird. Like, I wouldn't say this movie is like unforgivable or like predatory. I just had some questions about it, but I did like the coming of age contrast. Any kind of atmospheric, very setting based coming of age film is gonna get me a little bit, and so this was a very pleasant and like immersive watch. It was the kind of movie where you do feel like the feeling kind of stays with you. Like, the second it ends, you're still experiencing what you just saw. So I did like it, and I did find it thought-provoking and moving.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Leeson. This is my husband.
Oh.
Oh, he's only my husband for, how much longer is it now? 60 days?
59.
Ah, that's better. Only 59 days. And don't worry about him. He has a continental mind.
Yes.
Another Cary Grant and Irene Dunn pairing. I watched this movie as a kid, but I haven't seen it in a really long time. I did not remember any of it, but this is so good. This is just a top tier screwball comedy, one of the best. Irene Dunn is just chewing the scenery in this. One of the greatest movie setups, I think, is Cary Grant going through a divorce. He, I think, is somehow underrated for his comedy, especially his physical comedy. Like, for me, it's like him and Dick Van Dyke that do things that are so funny, but I'm also like, how did you even do that with your body? Irene Dunn just brings such a special flavor to these movies. She has such a modern sensibility to her. The way that she kind of like smirks her way through this movie and is like in on all of the humor just feels like a very modern approach to comedy. Just her line readings and the way that she interprets this script is just feels so fresh and so current. This movie, it's called The Long Hot Summer, and it's a long movie. Orson Welles has one of the craziest tans I've ever seen. Not his worst. One of my favorite genres of films is the 1950s doing the like Edwardian Victorian time period. It's like when you put like a saturated filter on something and then you accidentally put it on a second time and it's like, whoa, that's like way too much. Like one of the most repressed decades, making movies about one of the other most repressed decades. Colors are always so elevated, the costumes are always so elevated. It's so like outwardly garish and kind of flamboyant.
Had your mind all made up about me, didn't you? Thought I didn't drink. Thought I didn't dance, too. Oh.
Scotch.
Scotch.
Big month for Irene Dunn. This was probably my least favorite of the three I watched, but it's still very good and worth watching. I do think, again, about old movies, people think of them as being kind of dated in a conservative way, and the whole premise and comedy of this movie is how like horny and hypocritically horny the whole town is, and like, yes, they want to be so buttoned up and conservative, but they're actually all just kind of wild and not really living like that. I don't even want to say it's ahead of its time, because my whole point is that it is of the time, but it's just very unconventional. Like, it's not appealing to the norms, willing to get into these topics, and a reminder that people have always been hypocritically horny. This was a cute, fun coming of age, very naturalistic. Like, I'm not sure any of it was scripted. It felt like just that it was capturing just teenagers hanging out, which I always like and enjoy to see. It's nice because a lot of times when movies are made about teenagers, the dialogue is so like cringy and weird and so clearly written by adults. And this really felt like it let its teen cast, who I think is mostly not actors, just like let them be kids and let them be themselves. And it was able to capture something that isn't often captured on camera. It didn't feel like it had any kind of agenda. It was just trying to speak to a certain teenage experience. This movie really captured a certain kind of loneliness, which is like the loneliness when you're in a group or like in a crowded room or at a party, like the loneliness that comes from close interaction and like the loneliness that can come from intimacy and the absence of it. I think oftentimes when I see movies about lonely people, it's a lot about them not being in the world and like being like literally physically alone. And this was just a really interesting movie about when you are surrounded by people who are trying to help and how heavy it can feel when it's not working.